Paul was the rock of Record Plant. He was the stable force amongst all the crazies.
Really, everybody loved him.
He did everything, everything that made Record Plant easier to work in.
He was just an all-around amazing personality, and I don't know if he knew how good he was, but you wouldn't know he knew how good he was.
Man, he was there for all of us.
I can honestly say that there's not a day that goes by that I don't think about him.
As Prestopino said at one of the NAMM meetings, when a guy was trying to explain a digital machine to us way back before anybody had one, Paul interrupts him. He says, you just need to understand one thing. These guys from Record Plant have no technical knowledge at all.
Paul Prestopino was a musician, inventor, and technician with a long and varied career. But from 1970 until its closure in 1989, Paul was a technician at the Record Plant in New York City, a venerated studio that helped produce an endless stream of hit records and launched dozens of careers for the engineers and producers that worked there. While working at the studio, Paul, known to everyone as Presto, was charged with the maintenance and care of the recording equipment, but he also played on dozens of albums for bands like Aerosmith, The Hooters, Alice Cooper, Slade, and Edgar Winter. He was an integral member of the bands of Peter, Paul and Mary, John Denver, and the Chad Mitchell Trio. Paul was part of the lifeblood of the Record Plant, and his passing in 2023 was felt deeply by those who worked with him at the studio. Our very own John Aniello organized this special memorial episode for Paul, where we interview Record Plant alumni and Paul's brother, Greg Prestopino, to pay homage to a man who touched so many lives through his work and music. To kick things off, we'll hear from Jack Douglas and Jay Messina. Both called the Record Plant their home, and together are responsible for albums from John Lennon, Aerosmith, Cheap Trick, Patti Smith, and many others.
You always felt covered with Paul. When he was around, you always knew everything was going to be okay.
Yeah.
And he was so comfortable on both sides of the glass, either playing or fixing something. This never really happened, but I used to fantasize about Paul that if you would call him and say, like, Paul, the console in Studio A is on fire. Paul would ask you before he would come in with a fire extinguisher. He'd say, "Well, what kind of does it have a blue flame?" But that aside, seriously, in reality, he would ask you these kind of questions. But when he came in, he would already know what the problem was, and he'd fix it in a second.
Yeah, Roy and Shelley, definitely Paul, were the very heart of Record Plant. It's made it what it was. Mm. We revolved around that, all of us.
Yeah.
But very comfortably knowing that those, maniacs were in charge of it. The thing about Paul, it's like I have this like really special relationship with him for a number of reasons. But one of them is that he hired me to work at Record Plant. I mean, I walked in there. I had just done a record with Tony May where I was playing bass. And I asked Tony if he would give me a job at A&R, and he said, absolutely not. But he told me that there was a studio down on 44th Street that was in a rebuild situation and they might be looking for people. And I walked in there. It was early July or late June, 1969. And I walked in there, and the guy sitting in the receptionist booth was Paul. And I said to him, I'm looking for a job. And he said, we're looking for a janitor. And I said, I'm your guy. And I got hired just like that by Paul. I started the next day. So Paul always had he always had a special place in my heart because he got my career started. I mean, had I walked in and asked Chris Stone or any of the old guard that worked there for a job, they would have said no.
We interviewed Jack live at AES in 2017, episode number 32, and Jay was our very first guest in episode number 1. These and all Gear Club episodes can be found at gearclubpodcast.com or wherever you get your podcasts. Next, we hear from Record Plant alums on lessons they learned from working with Paul. Carol Caffiero and Frank Peacock were Record Plant assistants. Danny Cacavo and Paul Special were staff engineers, and Paul Wolf was a record plant regular as an outside technician.
So Presto, the kind of guy he was, he taught me a life lesson. And the life lesson is something I'm still alive. I'm still doing it to this day. He had this wisdom of if you're doing a repeating multi-step task and you're repeating it, okay? So multi-step. Keep the same tool in your hand and do all of the repetition, like, for example, an onion. An onion. So you're going to slice the top and the tail. You don't put that knife down. You do all the onions, top, tail, top, tail, top, tail. You cut them. And then you peel them. Then you peel the one, then the next, then the next. Every time you change your tool, you've lost efficiency. Okay? So if you want to stay efficient with your time, you always keep that tool in your hand until you're done with all of the ones that you're doing. And to this day, I use that all the time in everything I do. And I thank Paul for that.
I'm not sure how much of this I learned from Presto directly or just by osmosis or watching him, but I'm troubleshooting constantly. And I remember so clearly Paul knowing, okay, the problem can't be here, it can't be here, it's got to be here. And I'm amazed to this day, there are a lot of people who don't get that. And that's something so fundamental that Paul really, because when I first started there, I was in the shop for 3 months. And I think watching Paul do that sort of thing really, really made a difference and I absolutely love troubleshooting. I do it every day.
Presto was like, he wasn't like a teacher. He was kind of like, you did perfection by osmosis. You didn't want to look like a dumbass around him. And he took time to do everything. He knew ahead of time, this is going to take me exactly 17 minutes. And if you tried to rush him along, it would take 17 minutes, period. And you see him do that, and then you see the end result is done because he doesn't have to do it again.
One of the most valuable lessons I ever learned from him was, how to approach things logically. He approached everything very logically, and that really always held with me. And any kind of troubleshooting is all based on logic. It's like, well, where does it start? Where does it end? Mm-hmm. What's going on in the middle? Where does it, where do we know we have it? And where do we first see that we don't have it? Just hanging out around him and watching how he did what he did, you would pick that up. And that's the main thing I remember taking from him was, how to just remain calm and, stay focused on a problem. And, and like we said before, you didn't really break stuff because you didn't want to necessarily get the wrath. It was like, he was warm, but at the same time, if you did something wrong, man, he would let you know that you were an idiot, like instantly. You'd be like, and then you'd be like, well, I just wasn't thinking. And he'd be like, exactly.
I remember getting Presto on the phone. I was having a problem. I said, well, I patched out of this and into that, and I'm getting this feedback loop. And he stops me and he goes, now, why would any sane person want to do that?
This group has an impressive list of credits that you can find in the links on the episode page at gearclubpodcast.com. And Paul Wolf has his own Gear Club episode, number 42, where he discusses, among other things, developing seminal recording equipment for API. Steve Marcantonio was on staff at the record plant from 1978 to 1986, working on records with the Jay Giles Band, John Lennon, Kiss, and many others. Steve recalls working with Presto and his ability to be a keen voice of reason in the studio.
When I first started there, I was doing a record with Garland Jeffries, and Gray Russell was assisting Sam. And I was still brand new. I had no idea what a compressor was or even a bus or nothing like that. So this was all like, wow, man, this is incredible. And Garland did live vocals on every track. And Sam had to run out And Garland was ready. He says, push record, Gray. So Gray hit record. And those were the days when assistants would let engineers know, hey, you're hot on this. You're, could use more level here, blah, blah, blah. And Gray, I don't know if he said anything to Roy or if not, but when the song was done, Garland's vocal was slamming the VU. And Sam just laid into Gray. It's dangerous. It's dangerous. What are you doing? So Roy, even though I'm sure he knew, Roy said, let's get Presto in here. So Presto came in and we said, we recorded this vocal and Sam seemed to think it's too hot. So he goes, well, let me listen. And he hit play and he looked at the meter and he goes, well, what does it sound like? And even though I was brand new into this business, I knew exactly what he was talking about. What does it sound like? Not what does it look like? And that's in my head now forever. That's the best input I got initially at the record plant. What does it sound like? And we can use that even to this day because so many people are saying, let me see that. You can't see music. You got to hear music. So that was very, prophetic, and many more times like that too. But that's ingrained in my memory for sure.
And what did it sound like?
It sounded fine.
I bet.
It sounded fine. There was no, there was no distortion or anything like that. It was, Garland got into it a little bit more and maybe leaned forward, but it sounded fine. And, if there was a little distortion doesn't hurt anything. It's all about the performance,
Yeah, right on.
Be sure to check out Steve's own Gear Club interview in episode 86. Shelley Yakis was on staff at the record plant from 1970 to 1980, engineering and mixing records for Tom Petty, John Lennon, Alice Cooper, Aretha Franklin, and so many others. In this clip, he recalls how Presto was always there to help solve a problem, no matter how far out.
He saved my ass so many times in the studio. I remember one time where it was more than one time, but this particular time, I'm working with Rick Derringer, and I think Rick was producing Edgar Winter, and we were doing these background voices. And so we finished the background voices. They say, let's double it. And there's no more tracks, and there's no more machines. And I'm sitting there thinking, how the hell am I going to do this? And I explained to Rick Derringer what the issue was. And I get this crazy idea, which I could always run by Paul because he never made me feel uncomfortable about it. And I go back to Paul and I say, Paul, can you disconnect the erase head? I'm going to try to record over the track that I just recorded on with the backgrounds, like a double exposure.
Oh, boy.
Can you disconnect the erase head so it doesn't erase the original? And he said, not a good idea. He said, I don't think I could do it for you anyway, but I don't think it's a good idea. I said, what about if I put a thick piece of cardboard over the erase head that was smooth? Do you think it would damage do you think the tape going across that cardboard would damage the emulsion or mess up the head from the cardboard in any way? And he said, I think if you're careful and you cut the cardboard to a decent size, the right size, he said, give it a try. He said, I never tried anything like this. How the hell do I know if this is going to work? But, he said, it sounds like it could. So I covered the erase head and I explained to the group, you got one shot at this. Otherwise, we're going to go back and do the original. And, they made the performance all the way through without messing it up. And the most unusual thing happened. It was like a double exposure with a camera where the original got set back. So now you had two performances. One, when it got set back, it gave it depth. So the two sounded like fabulous. I wish I could do that today. I can't figure it out. But I went back and I told Paul, I said, Paul, everybody's very happy and thanks for encouraging me.
Nice.
Not making me feel like, what are you friggin' mind? Nobody does it.
That's great.
Most of the good stuff comes from desperate situations, Not anything I would think of without the desperation part. This really cool thing happened. I wish there was a box that would do it,
Yeah, right. But maybe, hey, John, maybe we talk to your brother about this.
That's a good idea.
See if Eventide could do the Shelley plugin.
Yeah.
I'll give you an address to send a check.
Okay.
we can call it the Yak Attack.
You can hear more from Shelley in his Gear Club interviews, episodes 64 and 65, available at gearclubpodcast.com or wherever you get your podcasts. Dave Hewitt ran the remote truck at the record plant, and Paul was a regular out on remote recording gigs. He tells the story of a dangerous job and Paul's ability to come up with simple but ingenious solutions.
A classic piece of his, he would occasionally come out in the remote truck to do tech, and we were out doing some goddamn thing, in an outdoor venue that was, some jive thing. I can't remember what it was. It wasn't very important, but we had to do it. And it was I don't know, maybe it had been horse waves or something, because there was a lot of sand and everything around. When we tried to hook up to the AC, that was always a problem on those gigs. Yeah. And we finally got it hooked up, but there was no ground. And we were having, it was trying to electrocute people with this. But Presto, looks at that and he says, well, it's because there's no fucking ground. It's all sand. There's nothing grounded. The AC for this building didn't have a fucking ground. It had something that went in there, but it wasn't. So what does he do? He goes and gets some kind of a stake and a sledgehammer, and he beats the shit out of this pipe, this metal pipe, and he keeps testing it, with a meter. And when he finally realizes that he's struck water, he's got a ground, hook the AC up to it. Okay, let's go.
Wow.
Amazing.
And we did the rest of it, and nobody got electrocuted.
For more about the record plant remote truck and Dave's career, check out Gear Club episode number 51. Presto made an impression on everyone, and the record plant staff was no exception. In this segment, we hear from Fred Ritter, who worked in the shop with Paul, Dave Thoner, Tom Panunzio, Paul Special, and Rod O'Brien, engineers and producers who are on staff at the record plant, along with Shelley Yakis and Paul Wolf on how Presto made an impact on them with his work ethic, point of view, and isms.
When Paul would get called into a room, almost the first thing he would say when he's called into a room, when there's something going on, some odd noise or something that's not coming through right or whatever it is, almost the first words out of his mouth every time would be, "What am I listening to?"
I remember that.
Which would really annoy a lot of people. And I never understood why they got annoyed by it, because it's the most logical thing to ask is, am I listening to something in the monitor chain? Am I listening to something off the board? Is this a channel being played back? Is it the source? What is it? And until you know that, you can't even begin to troubleshoot it, because you have to know where you're starting to know where to work upstream from or to work downstream from, depending on what the kind of the problem is. But people just they couldn't deal with it. What am I listening to? Well,
yeah,
you're listening to the problem. Well, but how? What's the chain? Where is it being tapped off from? Where is it being presented to me from?
Fred, I just got chills from you saying that, because I was in the control room many a time when he said that.
Yep.
And that was like his mind, like a detective.
Yep.
You know what I mean? Like that's how his mind worked. It was, that was crazy.
I think we all remember that.
Yeah, of course.
We were all on the receiving end of that at least, I don't even know how many times. And him just saying that was 90% of the time enough for you to figure out what was wrong. You're like, oh yeah, I'm not listening to the stereo bus. Thanks, Paul.
Yes.
Oh God.
Paul's classic line to me, I would be working and inevitably it would be fine all day when there was like John and Yellow was there and our whole staff was there. Everything would be fine. Come midnight, all of a sudden a fader wouldn't work, or the multi-track would start going backwards, or or Tom would light a flash pot off behind the bottom of the machine. Remember that time? That was great. I'd call downstairs and Presto would be like, "What?" And I'm like, "The faders are all going crazy. The mix is almost done. You got to get up here." And he'd be like, "All right, just don't touch anything." And the second he walked in the room with his toolbox and whatever else, and that real, he'd walk in there like, what?
Right.
And I would be like, okay, so I think it might be such and such. And he'd go, "Don't analyze. Just tell me what it is. Tell me what the problem is. Don't tell me what you think the problem is." And I just thought that was so classic Presto, But man, he was there for all of us.
Dave, you probably won't remember this, but I was a fly on the wall on a session you did with Tommy Conwell.
And the Young Rumblers.
And the Young
record
Rumblers.
That never got heard.
Right, and Rick Chertoff. But what I do remember about being there one day was the tape machine started smoking. And so Presto walks in and immediately, I think Teddy might have been the assistant or something, immediately turns to him, he goes, "Where's the razor blade? Where's the razor blade?" And he said, "Oh, the razor blade was on the tape machine." He goes, "Exactly. I told you never put the razor blade on the tape machine." And he didn't really, in his own way, he didn't scold him or anything. He was just like, picked it up, "Don't ever do it again," and walked out. My question to you guys would be, so you were doing all this crazy shit there. It sounds more like a reform school than it does a recording studio. But there was a seriousness going on where you guys were making hit records that stand the test of time. But while you guys were like attempting to destroy the studio, what was Presto doing? He couldn't have been
fixing. He was fixing.
See, the thing in that day, what was normal was a tech would be trained to get the client around the problem, not send them home.
Right.
Yeah.
Where some of the techs would say, "Well, why don't you go home and we'll have it fixed when you come back in tomorrow?" No, in the middle of doing stuff. No. But he was amazing at keeping the session going, showing the client and the second engineer and the engineer how to get around the problem until he could see it that night or the next morning, whoever was in the morning.
You get in that zone, and once the artist is in that window where it's like this is like the juice is flowing. If something goes south, you got to know that there's going to be somebody that you can just say, "Hey, can you come in here and do this? This is like really, really quick." And then, while you're talking to him on talkback, he's switching channels.
Right.
And the guy never knows it. And you never break that loop that he's in, that he's like, it's spinning up and it's starting to like turn into, you can tell, you can just smell the best sounding vocal track you ever had in your life. And if you crack that glass, it might take him 2 days to get back to that point. And Presto never, ever sucked the life out of the room when he walked into it, ever.
No. In Italian, presto means quick. And it was so like Presto, if it was like 9 o'clock at night and you had a problem in your session, you would call him and he would just come in and just be really quick at like, you know what I mean? At like fixing the problem.
What was great about him was no matter what you had, a phone machine, a carburetor, whatever you had, if you couldn't fix it, you took it to Paul and he would fix it. He never turned me down. He never said, "I can't fix that." And in return, he had a dish, I think it was, on his shelf above his workbench. And it always had pot or joints in it. And it was a communal. Like anybody could come in and help themselves. If you were doing a session and you needed some pot, you were welcome to it. You didn't even have to ask him. But, he got tired of hearing people say, "Can I give you some money for fixing that?" or whatever. And he would always say, "Just put something in the dish. Put something in the dish." And I go in there, and I always had a lot of pot. And whenever I would go in there and ask him to fix something, I'd put like an ounce or something in the dish and pulling over. But I mean, what a beautiful man to, just that idea, that communal idea, that family idea, as you said, Dave, that have that for everybody.
We used to have these blue cards. You remember the blue cards, guys?
Yeah.
And you'd fill out, and if you didn't fill it out with a detailed description of what was wrong with it, he would come in and go, useless.
Yeah.
But he would, if you asked, I remember asking him one time, I sat with him one night and he was showing me how to restring the guitar a better way than I used to do it. And he was doing the best thing. Paul had a great heart too. And I think this was with Shelley. We were doing Edgar Winter. And Edgar, being an albino, has really bad eyesight. And somebody had one of those little puzzle things where you move the pieces around and, get it all in place. And he couldn't do it because he couldn't really see it. So Paul took a look at it, said, I'll be back, went to the shop and cut one out of a 12 by, like almost a record cover size, cut out the pieces on the engraving machine, did all the numbers and all that stuff, and then came back in and gave it to Edgar and said, here, now you can do it.
Wow.
Wow. And it was a bit of work, but he did it because he wanted Edgar to be able to, participate.
For more about the record plant and their careers, check out our interview with Tom Panunzio in Gear Club episode 93 and Rod O'Brien's interview in episode number 30. Paul was a top-notch problem solver, but also a designer and inventor, coming up with many improvements to the equipment at the record plant and creating new devices for use in the studio. In this section, we hear from Eddie Soletti, who worked in the shop with Paul, and Jack Douglas, Tom Panunzio, Danny Cacavo, and Rod O'Brien, staff engineers and producers at the record plant.
He did everything that made record plant easier to work in. Those AKG headphones, he made that leather strap because the plastic strap would always break. All our headphones had leather straps, so they never broke. And he engraved all the panels. So even in the copy room, if you had to make tape copies or whatever, I have one of these panels at my shop and I still use it. All the mic panels. I guess he made some DI boxes and all the stuff that was in the truck. But the coolest thing, I think, that really just showed me how impressive he was, is that when in the mix room we got the GML automation, it had a group of 8 faders and maybe a master fader, I forget. But Paul made a complete imitation, a mini imitation of the woodwork for the Trident. Right. And in it were the 8 group faders. John, you would remember.
Right.
But was it?
Yeah, it was like
groups?
A box.
Yeah.
Yeah,
but it looked just like the Trident. It looked like Trident made it.
Yeah. He made everything. It was like it was so amazing. My favorite thing that came out of like the record plant was my analog ABCD box, where if you were comping vocals, you would patch into the 4 inputs. And it was like, just a metal box with the engraving, but it was nothing special. And it was 1 switch AB, 1 switch CD, and the middle switch was going between the one switch and the other switch. Mm-hmm. And I still have them. And it was, for a while I was doing, even during digital, I was doing a lot of analog stuff. And they would be so much fun comping with those boxes. It would almost be like a dumb performance of getting the right bits. Stuart, you had one for a while, right? We both remember. I got you one too.
That was so much fun. That was. You remember
so dumb,
sitting there?
But great.
But it was a brilliant idea. It made comping so much. I thought it was a revolutionary invention.
Yeah.
Is it engraved? Remember, Presto is like the master engraver.
Engraved was the A/B.
That's right.
And then C/D, and then the ABCD. So he did engrave that stuff, yeah. I forgot that I kept stacking. I never took the tape off from any comp.
Wow.
So I have literally this much tape on it from using it. But that, somewhere in there are 3 switches.
Yeah. That's great.
Like, I worked with the one band Dinosaur Jr. in the 90s in Dreamland on analog, and he would play like massive solos, and we would just sit there like performing the comp.
Yeah.
And then he would be like, let me do the comp. And then I'd hand him the box, and he would do the comp himself. I would just run the tape machine. It was fucking awesome.
Paul was just, he was my go-to for any number of things, from coming up with boxes, which one of the boxes we called a Jack in the Box, which was just a reversed bass roll off. And it boosted at 12 dB at 80 cycles instead of cut. And
hey, Jack, was it Paul that came in that day and had the box with every kind of connector in it?
Yes, the everything box.
I remember the everything box.
Yeah. All of these things were built by Presto as custom one-offs for us to use. I wish they were still around. They were some of the better things that were ever built.
And all the knobs for the consoles.
Yeah, he gave me a custom Jack Douglas knob, which I still have.
I was so proud when one day he made me one. And I walked into the studio to do a session. It was on the board. And I said, where did that come from? Wow. And they said, well, Presto. Who else? It just said Penunz. That's what everybody called me.
I have one that says Montrose for Ronnie Montrose.
You probably have
Presto
one,
never
Dave.
He never made me a knob.
There was a bin in the shop that was filled with them. It had like Bob Ezrin on there, and
Bobo Urzon. For some reason, he wrote did Bobo Urzon on a knob. I don't quite know how that came about.
Wow.
Does anyone remember Paul's instant flanger head stack?
No, but someone said he built something for Lennon, a double track machine for Lennon.
This may have been it, but it was a head stack so that it would record on 2 tracks of the 4-track, and then you'd push a lever, and it would change. By pushing the lever, you would push the tape in, and it would change the distance between the heads, and you could do this instant flange. Yeah.
Wow, that's genius.
I remember when the auction happened, and Presto made sure he got that.
Right.
Wow, man.
Yeah, he had a whole machine shop in the ground floor of his house. Like the neighborhood he lived in Roosevelt, New Jersey, was a Depression era made for artists community. And it was bare bones, cinder block, 1-story homes. But Presto's house was the only house in the block that had a second story. So he and Sarah lived on the second floor, and all of the heavy machine shop stuff that you would never bring upstairs was on the ground floor.
I just remember as an assistant, if the shit was hitting the fan in Studio B, if I got 5 minutes to walk out and go into the shop, it was like totally calming. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
He'd be sitting there playing his banjo, and I'd listen to music a little, and then I go back into the shitstorm.
Yeah, you might do a hit on one of his joints that he had going.
I don't think I'd ever do that, Jack.
Okay. No, all right. Yeah.
Well, that was the thing about Paul. You'd go in the shop and you'd say, hey, Paul, I got to do, this thing. And he'd be like, let me see. And then, 10 minutes later, he's fixing it or building it or redesigning it. This will be better. Do it this way, right? I mean, how often did he come in and say, why don't you guys do this? Paul would give you a hard time about doing something stupid, but at the same time, he'd teach you how to do it right.
Yeah. And he was never a dick about it. He was just matter of fact. It was like, that's the thing. He never, if he gave you a hard time, it was only like in a matter of fact way of this is how you should do it, which was perfect. I learned so much from him. And like whenever I had a problem and he came in the room, I was never worried that he was going to give me shit. I was just kind of into it. You know what I mean?
Paul was a fantastic and accomplished musician. While his main focus was on bluegrass and folk music, he also played on a number of rock and pop records at the record plant. Listen in as our record plant alums recall Paul's musicianship in the studio and on the stage.
Paul was willing to do anything. He was an incredible musician, but if it was something odd to be done, he was always up for it. And he would come in with a smile with whatever gear we needed. He'd come in with a mandolin, or he would come in with a guitar or a banjo. And the one really cool one I remember is on the Aerosmith record. He played slide banjo, which is really unusual.
Oh yeah.
And he doubled Brad's line on Last Child, which is like, for fans of Aerosmith, it's always been, hey, what is that? It's like
Paul Prestopino.
It's not just a guitar; it's like something else. And we had him playing stuff on Back in the Saddle, and he played acoustic on any number of projects I was doing. He was a constant go-to guy for us. We would always try to do a little bit more on Aerosmith albums that so would disguise the original sounds. For example, Jay playing vibes, marimba, right? Bass marimba on Sweet Emotion, doubling bass line. He doubled perfectly. This is pre-Pro Tools. He just locked it. And again, that gave you a bass sound that you couldn't figure out. The pedal was so high you had to stand on a ladder to play it.
Did you say I was so high I had to stand on a?
Well, that too. Oh God.
Hey, and Jack, what was that? The track that? Remember we used John Lennon's guitar, that big 7-foot.
Yeah, that was on Back in the Saddle.
Oh, and there was 3, and Paul was one of those.
Yeah, Paul was one of those. Yeah.
So, when you brought him in to do these sessions, I mean, he was pretty much a stone cold bluegrass folk musician, right? Was it odd for him to come in and work on rock and roll records, or did he just accept it?
Yeah, he totally accepted it. He was like, what do you need? What do you want?
Fabulous.
And
That's so great.
Come in with his toys and just do it. And the musicians, whether it be the guys in Cheap Trick or Aerosmith or whoever we were working with, they all loved him. I mean, if Paul was going to come in on a session, it was always going to be a lot of sunshine.
That's great.
What impressed me about, now I knew that Presto made all these things at the record plant, but one of the things that impressed me was just that I know that he played with all these people that I knew, like Peter, Paul, and Mary, and like I still see him on those PBS specials that are 20 years old now, and the Mitchell Trio, and I didn't find out until after he passed, but he was in the Greenbrier Boys, which is one of the seminal bluegrass bands of the folk era there in New York, and it just I was really impressed with that. He had at his station in the shop where he worked at his bench, he had his gold Aerosmith award above his bench there. It was so cool.
Only maintenance engineer I ever saw that had a platinum record hanging over his workbench.
Right.
Hey, I worked on an Aerosmith record. I didn't get a platinum record.
He worked on the Hooters record. He was the one who played banjo.
Right.
And John, you and Bill recorded that.
And we danced. I think so. And then he also played on like the third Hooters record, which when I was the engineer, he played dobro. But yeah, no, he definitely, I went through his discography this morning and I was like, oh, right, I remember that. And it was pretty amazing. And then I guess he was in the And We Danced video when they did the music video.
In the intro. It's great.
But yeah, no, it's fantastic.
Classic overalls. He's one of the original, back in the 50s when there were clubs in Manhattan that had, someone on bongos and someone on acoustic, and it was like
beatniks.
Yeah, Paul was one of the originals.
Yeah, and he has a gold record for Blue Oyster Cult.
Yep.
Not for playing. That one actually was for an edit. He did an edit on Beat the Reaper that made the song, and he got a gold record for it.
That is ridiculously amazing. Oh my God, that is funny. He added more cowbell.
Right. Like, I know he was gigging in the 60s, but would he run out and do and play?
Yeah, he had a band that he played with called Hold the Mustard. And it was a contra dance band, and they would just play, hoedowns and, weird gigs. And he played with those guys for years and years and years. In fact, I remember one time in the late days, Tom Swift even came in and, he brought the band in to record them.
Oh, wow.
And I remember that happening specifically, wow, Presto is in a band, and my first introduction to Presto was that credit on the back of Rocks. That's why I knew exactly what it was.
Wow.
I remember reading it in my room, and then all of a sudden I remember meeting the actual guy.
Wow.
Because I idolized those records. All those records that were done, and all those people, Shelley and Jay and Jack. I knew everything about that from reading those credits. And Presto, I remember meeting him and being like, this can't possibly be the same Paul Prestopino. He's a maintenance guy. I figured he'd be like a rock musician, But sure enough, I found out that no, this guy is so multi-talented that, not only can he take apart a tape machine and put it back together again in 30 seconds, but he also can play banjo and mandolin. And
he, in 2019, recorded a record with a band, a bunch of people from New Jersey, the Magnolia Street String Band. And the record was called Wrong Side of the Rain. And I guess he played banjo, dobro, and mandolin.
Paul played at my wedding.
Wow.
And how this happened was I got married up in the Berkshires. And I was looking, we were going to do contra dancing or something. So, I looked for some local musicians, and it turns out they knew Presto. So Presto comes out, comes to my wedding, and jammed and played with him for the whole thing. And it's like,
wow, man, that's
crazy.
The thing about Paul that was interesting to me after the fact, because I was always in touch with him, is that when Luca was born, I sent you guys that picture. He and Sarah made a quilt for my son Luca.
How cool is that?
So Luca decided that he wanted to play fiddle, and when Paul found out about it, he made a CD of all kinds of folk music: Zydeco, Canadian, French, Irish, and so I had the boys had little music players, and so I put it on a music player, but we had the CD too, and they played those things all the time. And they just, because Paul made these incredible liner notes of who the artist was and what style of music it was, it really left an impression. And so when Luca got his first fiddle, it was a gift. And they just they got involved with local fiddle group, and one of my neighbors knew a lot about bluegrass, and they just came into their own, being able to play. And so that when we came out in 2016, Presto lived not a half hour from my dad in Jersey. So on our way out of town, after I left, say goodbye to my dad, I said, we have to stop by and see Paul before we go. And so I told Paul we were coming. So the boys had their instruments, and the three of them jammed at Paul's house.
Oh, that's great.
It was just so great because, Paul was cool enough to play stuff that, and I don't know, somehow they all just played, but it was just so sweet that, that my boys made a connection. Like, I feel like I got Presto's kids.
Right.
Well, that's a really beautiful connection that no one we've spoken to has had, where he actually was in your kid's life.
Yeah, almost like a grandfather.
But in a musical way, which is kind of amazing.
Mm-hmm.
Shelley, did you ever use him as a musician?
On a few things. My clients needed a player that could play mandolin on one thing, acoustic guitar on something else, and we used Paul. He was just like what you're describing, he lived and ate and breathed this stuff without being stiff.
Yeah.
And if you presented him with a problem or something that needed to be fixed, he would just go about it in his own natural way.
The fact that he was a musician, How much of a factor do you think that was to his understanding of, or his desire to be around the recording environment?
Well, I think that what it enabled him to do is feel completely comfortable because he always knew what the client needed.
Right.
Client needed to keep the session going. Client needed confidence. The engineer needed to know that it was going to be okay and that there was solutions.
Yeah, he didn't want to be the groove buster.
Right. Because he was familiar with both sides of the glass, I think just through that understanding made him complete and made him so comfortable to have him around and solve these issues. And you could count on him. He was one of these guys that no one ever said, I don't know if he's going to show up. I don't know if he said he'd do it, but maybe he was just being nice. It was never even a thought or a question. He would just always be there.
When you love what you do, you don't work a day in your life. And that's what it was. He loved that. He loved every aspect of it.
He was happy as a clam doing what he was doing. He never talked about it. We had a lot of fun in the studio, believe me. We had great clients. Roy was amazing. The atmosphere there was amazing. It was a great training ground. Paul was just part of that in the greatest possible way.
All these great records you guys made, you know, he was part of the team. I mean, he might not have been in the room the whole time, but he was backing all of you guys up.
Yeah, and you knew that if you had a problem, that you weren't going to look bad to your client, because the worst thing that could happen is when your client loses confidence in either the studio or the session or the tech or me as an engineer or anybody else as an engineer, lose confidence, and once that happens, it's all in a tailspin. And you know, he always had my back.
In our final segment, John and Stuart talk with Paul's brother, Greg Prestopino, who composes music for film and television and has written songs recorded by the likes of Celine Dion, Bette Midler, and Natalie Cole. He gives us an inside look at how Paul got started in the music and tech world and what he was like growing up.
When I first started there in '79, like, you know, your brother was like a mythical force there, you know, worked from 4 to 12. He had his way. He was very much on point all the time. You know what I mean? If you did something stupid and you called him to come up to fix it, he would tell you that was stupid. But you learned a ton from him. You know, he was wonderful. And the shop at night was an oasis of just calmness and sanity, because your brother would be in there listening to music and it was just nice to be in there to get out of the room for 5 minutes.
He was a very sweet and very generous guy, you know, with his knowledge, with himself, you know. And, oh, by the way, I wanted to show you something. One of the things I took from home, the lime green overalls.
Oh, wow. Amazing.
Yeah, I left the rest of my figure. I like lime green. That was fine. I'll wear them sometime. I was going to wear them today, but I thought it would be too much and too many ghosts.
So what's the age difference between you and Paul?
8 years.
8 years. You know, you as a songwriter, and you both kind of went into the same field. Did you ever cross paths musically with him? Like, did you ever play together, write songs together, or?
Well, no, he didn't write a whole bunch of songs. He wrote melodies. He wrote a lot of fiddle tunes on the mandolin. You know, he played on some stuff for me here and in New Jersey. And he wouldn't do it unless I was in the room with him. For one thing, he had lost the high end, some of the high end in his hearing, and he couldn't hear the click. From then on, he insisted that I be there with him, doing it and producing the days. You know, so.
But his, you know, his deep love of folk music, traditional music, was that at all? Did that rub off on you at all?
Well, yeah. I mean, you know, the thing is, both of my parents were visual artists.
Right.
And so that space was pretty much taken up. Right. So, and I remember Paul playing banjo. He had this really odd banjo with the head was only this big, but the wood surround was out to here. It wasn't your standard. It was some old timey, strange, and he was learning clawhammer, which I never learned how. I could play Scruggs style, but I could never learn clawhammer.
Right.
And so I think he gave me my first guitar lessons. I started when I was 7, so he was 15, 16, whatever. And after a while, we used to play music together. He taught me tons. I mean, I made him teach me songs. I mean, like all the early Big Bill Brunzi stuff and Josh White stuff. And we're talking about, I mean, I remember us, me doing One Meatball after hearing him do it once. I had to do that song. But there was a bunch of them. I mean, Blind Blake stuff, the Bahamian Blind Blake, not the blues Blind Blake. And those were things we both knew intimately and would work on together. Now, how he learned to play bluegrass banjo, I think Weisberg Eric actually played before Paul did. And I think Paul heard Eric play. And I think that was like, oh, okay, something I have to. And then I'm sure he got a hold of I know he had, Jimmy Martin records and Scruggs records and, you name it. And he used to go to Washington Square Park, as I did later. We'd get on the bus and go into the city and play all day and then go home. He was playing with the Greenbrier Boys. You knew that, right?
I knew that, yes.
Yeah.
Amazing.
But he also was in a group called Three Folk Sing, which was Molly Scott was the girl, was Paul, and Brooks Jones was the guitar player singer. And they made a record somewhere in Princeton, believe it or not, I think. Or maybe they made the record in New York, but Brooks lived in Princeton. And they did a bunch of stuff. And next thing you know, he was working with John Denver. Well, with the Mitchell Trio first, right? And, Denver took over. And then Paul went out with John. In fact, the first time he and Sarah came out here, he was on tour with John Denver. They played Universal when the amphitheater was outdoors,
So you would go to see him perform?
Oh, yeah. I used to go whenever they were near here or if I was near wherever he was. But I mean, I started playing guitar at the age of 7, thanks to him. And my mother played guitar and everything else. My mother played violin, recorder, piano, and guitar, while helping support the family by illustrating children's books. He was one of those guys. This was like when I was really little, I remember I think I was 5 or 6, and his room was in the back of the house, and he would be up, interestingly, before anybody. And because he had gotten fascinated by taking apart radios and televisions. I mean, he had found a TV remember those with the first ones with screens this big and big, huge wooden cabinet, but the screen was like this. So somebody had given him one of those, and he was systematically taking it apart, bit by bit. But he was, we were not competitive because, as I say, I barely came up on his radar. We were so different in age that. He was great though. I mean, he was fantastically supportive. He was just there. If I asked him to do something, he would do it. It was just boom, So he was always like that though, as you were saying, John, he was generous that way. He would just, you need him, he's there.
Right. So his musical background is one thing, but his technical background
was happening simultaneously.
And that was self-taught?
Pretty much, yeah. I mean, I don't know if you knew this about him, but after high school, he went to this really crappy high school that we had, a regional high school he got bused to 5 miles away. Middle of New Jersey, right on the Mason-Dixon line, racist as all get out, just a miserable place. But, and they didn't know what was wrong with him because apparently, he was sort of failing some classes and then getting A's, and they thought there was something wrong with him. They gave him an IQ test, and what they thought was stupid was an IQ of 180. In high school, which is almost just about off the chart, right? And he ended up getting a full scholarship to Carnegie Tech, went for a year and a half and quit, which drove my father batshit crazy, okay? He always said he blamed it because he was young, and I think he was really unsure of himself in that world, that proscribed academic world. He was secure in learning things himself, which is, pretty amazing when you think about it. I mean, he just had his own. I'm pretty much the same way. I mean, I don't have that IQ, but we had to forge our own paths. I mean, I left home when I was 15, so you can see like we both had to do this thing, whatever it was. But I remember, like, as a kid, again, I was protecting him again because when he came home from school, he was really depressed. I mean, he felt like a failure. He had quit college, right? And he blamed it on his TA, on the teaching assistant, who he said had it in for him, was torturing him the whole time he was there and making him feel like a piece of shit, right? So that's why he came home. And then he'd sleep. He was depressed. He'd sleep till 1 or 2 in the afternoon. He'd be up all night, tinkering and doing shit and reading popular science, I'm sure, and reading sci-fi, all of which I inherited. And I still have those paperbacks, by the way. And we got closer and closer. I mean, as time went on, he said at one point that we made a great team. We were great collaborators because I could do what he couldn't do and vice versa. As you probably know, John, I mean, he was highly collaborative.
Yeah.
I mean, he was a great collaborator. I mean, if you could tell him what the problem was, he would generally have come up with a solution for it, and whether it was, a banjo part or, an API console that was buzzing, it didn't really matter. It was all the same stuff.
And do you remember what his first studio job was?
Oh, yeah, working for Phil Ramone at A&R. Because he had met Phil. What happened was he went and took a studio workshop up in Rochester School of Music, right?
Eastman? Is it Eastman?
Yeah, Eastman. That's right. Eastman Music School. And Phil, this is, I don't know, somewhere in the 60s. Phil was teaching a course, and Paul somehow found out about it and went and took the course. And I guess Phil was taken with him and gave him a job at A&R.
Wow, amazing.
That's great.
But he loved it. I mean, he was completely like, he came back from that like, okay.
That was
I'm ready.
He found his calling. Yeah.
I mean, as much as playing, I mean, he just, because he'd already been playing a lot. Then he got a job working in Princeton. When he came back, a guy named Ruby Scher, who was a quite well-known physicist, hired him to work. Princeton had a cyclotron. Right. Or whatever. I can't remember. I'm trying to remember the order of this because he went to Madison, Wisconsin, but he was working there also on their nuclear accelerator. And he would design parts for it. The actual physicist engineers, would say, well, we need something to do this. And he would design it and build it.
Wow.
I mean, I'm sure you're not that surprised. Put it in front of him and he was going to figure it out.
Your brother is such a legend. So I reached out to Loudon. I told Loudon I was out on Shelter Island. I said, hey, I really would love to be in touch with Greg Prestopino. He said, okay, tomorrow I'll email you his contact. I said, great. So he emails me your contact. I email what I think is you, and it's not you. And I write this whole thing. And
who was it?
It was Greg Cohen, Tom Waits' bass player.
Oh, hilarious.
Fantastic, very famous bass player. Writes me back this whole thing. I'm in Germany. I'm on the road, blah, 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 this whole thing. And he goes, and by the way, who's Paul? And I write back and I went, Paul Prestopino, who is this? And he goes, oh my God, Paul Prestopino passed away. He fucking knew your brother.
Oh, no way.
He knew your brother. He goes, I'm so sad about this. And what can I do to help? I'd be happy to talk to you, but I didn't know him that well.
Yeah, that's hilarious.
So I had to write Loudon back and say, hey, dude, you gave me the wrong Greg, but he was connected in some spiritual way.
That's great. Yeah.
Yeah.
I almost got Paul again. I was trying to get Paul to move here, by the way. He was working at Record Plant. Oh yeah, because I knew this is where the music business was. Right. And I had become friends with George Massenburg, and Massenburg knew Paul. He said, oh, he's a genius. I'd hire him in a heartbeat. Get him to move out here. But they weren't interested. They liked being where they were. He liked the family that he had at Record Plant. He liked, once he had settled in there, he loved it. And I only ever once saw him in tears, which was at the auction.
Oh, wow. Wow.
And I went with him because I went with him again to protect him. I felt like, he's going to need some hand holding here. And I wasn't wrong, and it was, horrible for him.
Yeah, that was a rough afternoon.
Well, Greg, beautiful, man.
Yeah, thank you so much. Great to see you again.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm going to miss him. I mean, it's like you can't help it. I mean, he filled his own space entirely and welcomed everybody else in.
Yeah.
All right.
Greg,
Adios.
beautiful, man. Thank you so much,
Greg.
Gear Club Podcast is sponsored by Eventide, and they're running a special promotion just for Gear Club listeners. You can go to store.eventideaudio.com and use the promo code GearClub15 for 15% off your purchase of Eventide products. Some exclusions may apply. Go to GearClubPodcast.com for details. Big thanks to Eventide for their sponsorship and the special promotion.
For extras from the episodes, like playlists, links, and videos, head over to GearClubPodcast.com. Sign up for the newsletter, and come say hi and follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Gear Club Podcast. Thanks for listening.
And please, if you like what you hear, let us know and leave a review.